Morning. How's everybody doing? So it's great to see who the audience members are too. I represent yet another area. My day job is in academia. My night job is in investing and working on boards for nonprofits. So I'm trying to figure out how to take some of the things that we're seeing early days in blockchain and healthcare and bring those to market. So that's where getting an early look is oftentimes very useful. So I sit at the University of Central Florida in Orlando, for those of you who don't know what it is too, and it was great to see the panel yesterday and hear some of the things that they were talking about. I want to follow up on some of those areas too and give you a little speed tour of some of the things that we're seeing in the market space, some of the different areas, and some of the early examples in a non-attribution way. Anything that I'm showing you, I'm not endorsing that. I'm just giving you an objective look at some of the different groups that are starting to work in these areas that you might see. So we're at a large institution. We've got the highest number of undergraduate students in the nation, and we also have a new med school, which means we get to start building things from the ground up with students who started out with the blockchain as a thing right when they started in med school and the med school started. So that kind of changes the perspective and dynamic. We're in a whole community that is built around training and simulation, which a lot of that, about $1 billion in Orlando, is in medical simulation and medical training. The military is a big part of that, as are our med schools and other areas too. We also have a new section of town called Lake Nona Medical City, which is again being built from the ground up during this same time frame, whether that be with our own VA, Veterans Administration, and also Nemours, Freestanding Children's Hospital, our med school, University of Florida's Pharmacology School, all in one central concentration. This creates opportunity. Blockchain by itself is not going to move the needle the way that looking at blockchain and fill in the blank, whatever your area of specialization is, whether that's in pharmacy, whether that's in the Internet of Things and how it's reshaping healthcare, whether that's in administrative practice, or any number of other areas. Those are the areas that are starting to move the needle. Ours is in the Internet of Things, as I mentioned before too. We are looking at things as diverse as how self-driving cars are reshaping our roadways, having a whole living lab of an intelligent home that was built from the ground up with Cisco and Johnson & Johnson and GE and our own Florida Blue, along with the Lake Nona Institute, to figure out how these different technologies are all going to work together. Blockchain is a fundamental data solution behind those areas. And one of my favorites is wearables. And we're going to look at some of the ways that wearables are being used right now too, and the number of sensors that are out there. All of this data that we get has to be managed in some way. The question you might ask yourself is the blockchain one of those ways that you can do that? It's not going to meet every single test, especially with the speed of many blockchain solutions now. Do we believe those speeds are going to get faster to meet this adoption curve and to be able to meet the need that we see? We do. Those are some of the things that we're watching for very closely and looking at how we combine blockchain and, in my case, simulation, blockchain, and Internet of Things, and what are the areas that you're going to work in. When we start looking at some of the areas where wearables are coming into play, it's not just for the wrist anymore. It could be something as diverse as shoes, as even contact lenses are starting to come in too. And where will people adopt these and have them? Will they even have them embedded inside of themselves too for immutable tracking? What does that sound like? We start to look at ways that we might be able to do those things, maybe first in our pets, and then with children, abduction, and other things like that too. These are all areas that might be influenced by this area. In our little laboratory called the Mixed Emerging Technology Integration Lab, we get a chance to play with all these technologies. Take the things that we learn from working for Google or working with Johnson & Johnson or a number of others, and work with them both in the government and military context. There's a lot of military medicine out there too, and a lot of projects we've done in those areas, along with the healthcare providers and the social causes and social good. I was really glad to see that on one of the panels yesterday too, because the way we can put this technology and democratize things across many, many nations is going to be central to how we can really move the needle on global health and population health too. I was just at a conference with some global thought leaders this past week in the Bahamas too, with people like Peter Diamandis, Aubrey de Grey, Robin Smith, who runs Cura, all thinking about how you could do this on a global scale and how close some of our nearest neighbors in the Caribbean are. Heard the term medical tourism? Yes, okay. So the things that we can't do in this country because of that large scale I guess the CMMS diagram that Alex put up, what could we do with less regulation in other places, and how would that influence? So our projects that we have started out, I was really humbled by some of my students early on when they came to me and said, hey, you've got to look at this thing, Bitcoin and blockchain. This is about 2012. So I started looking at it. It took me about 3 times for them to explain it and have me understand it. I was really humbled by that too. But I learned from my students every day. And they were some of the ones that were being paid early when it was still $20, $60 a coin. They were getting all their pay in Bitcoin. They've done quite well now too, thinking about that too. Crypto millionaires that have come out of our institution too from that. But also another thing that spawned from that was they asked me if I would help them get a project. So we did something called Health Shares through a program that the National Science Foundation and NIH and DoD all support. This is basically the same lean startup principles that have been used in Silicon Valley for many years that have been codified into something the government can use. And we were able to do a project under the National Science Foundation called Health Shares. Now, we learned a lot. We learned how slow some of the protocols were during that era to be able to do things like electronic health records. I won't make you raise your hand, but I'm sure a lot of you see some heads nodding that you're thinking that might be the thing. It still could be, but there's significant speed issues during that era. There's other things that you have to think about too when looking at that. We got to explore some of those early. We also wrote a book on this early a few years ago called Blockchain-Enabled Applications, which is very different from crypto investing. It's really about how the blockchain as a fundamental technology is shifting, whether you want to say fintech, whether you say regtech, like we talked about government, govtech, whether it's your use in real estate, whether it's your use in healthcare. Those are the different areas that we covered. So about 20% of that book. And then they asked us if we would write another one to take the kind of mess of this space, these different categories too, some of which came from Hashed Health and then Andrea Corvoros that put this chart together. I thought it was good to kind of see that. Now, we're not endorsing any of these companies or anything else, just giving you an idea of how many players there might be in certain segments of the space too. And also why there's the need for a book that we're writing now with HIMSS, the Health Information Management Systems Society, to put some ideas around this and put a book together on that area. We've also been working on a blockchain simulator, how we can have multiple test nets and have the human in the loop to do testing on these. Some of the biggest problems with blockchain are not the blockchain itself, it's the humans that are using it too. And we can see that from anything from the Japan break-ins to some of the other areas that are the most vulnerable parts in the whole process. We have a fund that we started to try and enable some of this too and take some of our student ideas and bring them out, merging traffic. And also one around bringing some of the best ideas from Israel and bringing those into the US. We have a call for action for any of you who are international right now too, that brings some of those ideas through Florida, 50% match from the Israeli government to go and build out some of those ideas and inspire innovation and bring that to the US market. So we're trying to take some of the best of Florida and bring it out best of the world and bring it out to, from Florida or through Florida into not only the rest of the US, but out into Latin America and the Caribbean. And that's what our blockchain and healthcare strategy is too. We're working with organizations, nonprofits like Hashed Health too. If you haven't heard of them, you might want to look at some of their information and some of the conferences coming up, Distributed Health in a few weeks, and where they're looking at blockchain to do the things you see up here. I'm not going to read any slides to you, but just wanted them kind of for background context and texture. And also Science Distributed too, looking at how research is going to change. Any researchers in the audience too? Think about the veracity of the research results we read in the newspaper every day. How many of those studies have been validated, have been revalidated, have been proofed against too? Think about what the blockchain can do for verifiable information. We all talk about in the news cycles about fake news and things like that, but what happens when it's your science that is bad? And when you can't prove it or can't verify it, or someone has an interest in that too, an inappropriate interest in those areas. Those are things that we're watching very closely and following some of the top leaders in the world in those areas too. And this is also being done in conjunction with the government too, wanting the same validity and reliability in the data that they have too. So it's not a us versus them, it's a all of us together. How do we make this better for the US and the world? We're also looking at some of the different projects. We are watching some of the ones that are trying to do some of the early examples of electronic health records and changing those for the better. We'll see if some of the ones that, again, not endorsing any ones, we'll see if some of the ones that are in there actually have opportunities to change that. And it's also interesting because some of the big players are also doing the same thing, and you're seeing them trying to form consortiums to catch up with the little guys in many cases too. And that's where some of you who are investors, you might not have to invest in what's going to happen for 10 years. You might be investing in what's going to happen for 2 years from now when they all realize they want to buy X, Y, or Z company, small business, ICO that started that has a really good idea. So those are the things that are market movers and really start to disrupt too in the early parts of the economy, the same way that we saw it in the early days of the internet too. That's some of what we're thinking it might happen with the improvements in the EHR with blockchain technology, and also the way that we can look at the changes in artificial intelligence and how AI is going to change this as well too. And we're looking at some of those groups that are looking at those areas and trying to have things that are more patient-directed. Tip of the hat to you for your Vanderbilt background too. There are some that are also trying to take the standards that are emerging too. How many of you heard of FHIR, F-H-I-R? Okay, so they're trying to look at how FHIR and other standards can be used and integrated with blockchain. So there are some nascent efforts. You have to look pretty closely. You have to look at places like academia. You have to look at government. You have to look at some of the places that could be a spin-off from those areas. That's the other areas that you want to think about too when you think broadly about where would innovation come from. I already mentioned about international as well too. So many people have blinders on and look at what's going on in the US. Well, a lot of the innovation that we're looking at is coming from far and wide and from countries you would never expect. Well, those of you in the crypto space would expect Estonia and other places like that too in the Eastern Bloc. But those are some of the areas that we're watching very closely. We're also looking for new models that are not in the healthcare space yet, but might come into the healthcare space. What if you could pay your patients to be healthier? I'm going to look at some of the docs. What if you could pay your patients to be healthier? Steemit is right now paying people for their best posts and paying the people that review the post as well, too. So it's a two-sided economic model. This is a fundamental shift that blockchain can enable. If you can pay the producer of that knowledge or that material, and you could also pay the consumer of that. Think about your health consumers too. You can pay them for good behavior too. This may really drive some of that areas, especially if you gamify it. I was at a conference this summer talking about the gamification of some of these health principles and choice architecture, how you motivate behavior too. Whoever cracks the code on that is probably going to do very well too. Those are some of the things that we're looking at right now too. Those same principles applied from another industry segment of the blockchain space, applied into crypto, and into healthcare. We're also looking at the ways that some of the other groups that are looking at use of different patient records, data, big data, and data science are all starting to come together too. Whether that be some of the ones that are doing AI, Doc AI, and some of the ones that are looking at ways that you have different benefits for your data to be analyzed and processed in an automated fashion. What does that sound like? Smart contracts, right? So we start to apply the principles of smart contracts with the principles of healthcare, and maybe you put a certain engine onto it too. You name your favorite one, whether that's Google DeepMind or whether that's Watson from IBM or others too. There's a lot of other ones out there. That's what starts to move the needle on how you could automate some of that process. So I'm excited about a lot of things that I'm seeing about the blockchain and how it's changing the world. I had a couple of things that I saw recently too from places like Harvard Business Review that are trying to track some of this too and seeing where the market's moving, and also some other areas too of why the blockchain is really going to be fundamentally reshaping things. And I thought about this a little differently, not just for Bitcoin, but I thought this was a nice quote from Marc Andreessen. I'm not going to read the quote to you, but I'm going to tell you what I was thinking about when I was reading this quote. That the fundamental change from what Netscape did to simplify the complexities of working, anybody working on the textual web, that was where I started, was in the text-based web. And then we had a graphical browser from Netscape. That's what simplified everything and hid all the back-end complexity from the average end user, made it graphical, and put that together. That also fundamentally made it so that it was easy for any one of us to distribute things as equal to the best publishers in the world through the web. Copy and repeat over and over again. What's changed now? We have the ability to move something from one place to the other in digital space and have very good verification that it is moved from not just one trusted source that we have to trust, but from multiple sources. I think that fundamental shift is what's going to help all of us feel secure with the privacy of our health data, with the things that we might need to do or want to do, with some of the advances in our medical records, and to have this democratization where we take back some ownership and have a shared ownership almost with our healthcare providers too. That's where I think that health will move, and that's where I think that the fundamental first principle of what's happening with blockchain really gives us a new capability, or a better capability than some of the other solutions that do distributed applications and that do distributed trust. So those are some of the different areas that we've been thinking about at University of Central Florida and within our network too. We're excited about some of the things that are happening with some of you in your areas. I hope this inspires you to think about some of the areas that you could apply blockchain plus whatever blank comes after that too. Whether it's in analytics, whether it's in your patients, whether it's on the payer side, the provider side, and put those different components together too. So I wanted to give you just kind of a little speed tour to get the juices flowing too before we move into fireside, right? So any quick questions before we move to the fireside, Bonal? Yeah, sure. Yes, sir.
I think that's very, very good presentation and a lot of information. How can I get your presentation?
How can you get the presentation? Yeah, see me after and I'll give you a copy of it too, a PDF. So, or send me a note if you want to just grab it from right there too.
Okay, so does this work? So keep your mic on. I think you should keep your mic on.
Okay.
And I want to ask, Rick Kimball's going to co-moderate for me today, and his heavy background in healthcare investment, and I think, just go on with David and flesh your things out.
All right, great. Thanks, Alex. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Rick Kimball. My background is I spent about 30 years in investment banking. I was a partner at Goldman Sachs and ran the healthcare investment banking business there. I've also been on the board of the Brookings Institution for about 10 years and joined that board to work with Mark McClellan on healthcare reform issues. And I got involved in crypto, really sort of saw the crypto light only about 6 or 9 months ago and realized that this is just going to be game-changing technology for healthcare. So I'm super interested as to where this goes. So thank you, David, for your talk here.
Rick, you want
Yes.
those guys to sit down over there too, because we're filming it and it's
Okay.
very consistent with
All right.
what everything
Sure.
else.
All right,
It's
great.
a Great video.
You want this back? Yeah. There you go. Thanks. All right, Rick.
All right, great. So thank you, David, for your presentation there. I agreed with the comment from the stage that there was so much content in there. I was taking notes furiously, and I'm eager for a copy of those.
Had to give the speed tour so we can spend the rest of the day unpacking that, right? So,
yeah, exactly. So I know you've been an entrepreneur prior to being a professor.
Mm-hmm.
I look at this from an investor's perspective, and we've got lots of investors
Right.
In the audience. I'm always eager to understand from academics what you're seeing that's on the cutting edge that's relevant for investors. So I was quickly running through doc.ai and various things that you were referencing. Mm-hmm. But what are some of the insights that you're gleaning in terms of how investors ought to look at these startups and maybe how you think about working with investors as you're doing research? Help us understand how we can leverage your work.
Yeah, a lot of the people that I work with at University of Central Florida, it's almost like our retirement jobs to be in academia and get to play with the cutting edge of technology too, and then see what we want to, outside of the university, invest in too. So I'm right there with you in many cases too. Using programs that are structured for managing innovation, like that I-Core program that I mentioned too, has really helped us frame the different ideas and have a way to look at it the same way that Silicon Valley investors look at it, the same way that Twitter was looked at early when it was in the lean startup mode too. What I look at every day is where are some of these technologies having a fundamental change, and what are the different patterns too. One of the patterns that I'm watching right now too is the area of what's happening with securitization, okay? Whether that's secure token offerings versus ICOs, a little bit less of the wild, wild west, especially if you're going to be in a highly regulated industry like healthcare. I think that's something that you really have to look at and be careful of too. I also think that looking internationally is very smart too. There's a lot of things that are moving very, very fast too. For those who'd asked for the presentation, I've got about 10 more examples of things that we're seeing, like what's happening right now where they're creating 3D bioprinted body parts and then having to track those. Also tracking those types of surgeries that might be done overseas, tracking drug counterfeiting. These are all areas that are ripe for change across the whole globe, and that I think people are going to really win in when we start looking at this from an investment standpoint. So I might be more of an entrepreneur, investor hiding out in academia than I am a true academic, and there's a lot of other people like that too. Seek them out in your communities too, especially those of you in Northern California. You'll throw a rock and hit one, but you'll find a lot of people that have this same thought process around how do you take things and spin them off from a public entity like the government or like a university and make those available out to the world. You can probably think of 50 famous spin-offs too if you start to put your imagination to work too. There's one little one called Google I've heard of too, right? So if you like that, those are the things that you might look at when you think about the startup culture, the academic culture, the government culture, and also, of course, the investment culture.
And so, David, on that front, are there opportunities for investors to work with you to collaborate on projects that you've got? Are there projects that you want to spin out that you're looking for capital to put into?
Yeah, there are always projects that our students and our faculty are looking at that they want to spin out too. So we try and vet them, and then we oftentimes partner and co-invest. We have a fund right now, the Emerging Traffic Fund, that is really kind of a fund of funds. And it's also working with a couple of groups in Atlanta, as well as our own Global Blockchain Ventures Fund, which is to take those international opportunities, pair them up with things that are coming out of Florida, and have the best of both worlds, or the best of the global economy too. So we're open to that. I'm happy to talk to people about that. I don't want to endorse anything, including my own stuff too. But we're excited about some of the work that we're doing, like the blockchain simulator that we're building, and other things that we think will really help both move healthcare, but more importantly, move health. And how do we do that? How do we help people? Preventative medicine, wellness, those are the things we're working with some large companies and small startups in those areas. I think there's a lot of opportunity with a democratizing technology like blockchain to help democratize health and pull it into an area where you have some control of that and your customers have some control of that. That's going to move the needle.
And so, as you talk to these big companies that are working on projects, what are they? Are they ready for this technology? How are they approaching this?
Well, I think we have to go back to Alex's first chart too. Some are angry, some are in denial, some are accepting reluctantly too. But there are some that are really tech positive and forward thinking too, and we're watching them closely. What I have seen as a trend is the best big companies that form a blockchain group. That blockchain group becomes a spin-off, either something that's endorsed by that organization or that goes rogue and goes out. That's what I've seen happen so far, because everybody who starts to go down this area realizes the potential and is leaving those big companies too, is what I have seen. Now, maybe that trend will reverse. Maybe there'll be enough people that they pay enough money to stay or lock them up with some lockup clauses too. But what's going to happen is it's a really good virtuous circle, because those entrepreneurs will go out. They'll have a relationship with that company. They'll go and build something with less risk to the big mothership of the company. And then it might get bought back in for 10x investment opportunity for you guys. Watch for those groups very closely. That's who I watch for oftentimes too, and see, well, what happens when the Phillips blockchain team goes out and where did they go? Kind of doing some sociograms to see who did what. They already had a head start. They already had access to capital, access to corporate thinking and enterprise level scale. What can they do and what do they do? And that's just one example of where you might look to see what's going to happen.
I think that's a very clever idea, and we're going to have a panel later today on enterprise, but I tend to believe that all these incumbents have the innovator's dilemma, and that they're not going to be able to disrupt the industry, and so it's actually going to be these spun-off teams that leave United Healthcare or Pfizer.
Goes right back to Clayton Christensen at Harvard Business School 101, basically, how do you keep the mothership from eating their young? Within the organization, how do you keep it separate? Well, sometimes the best way to keep it separate is to actually let it go and be free and then come back too.
And are you working with some companies on strategies like that, or of spinning out teams and businesses?
We are. We're trying to help some of them keep their innovation core inside too, figuring out what incentives might help with that. But there are so many that are ready to spin off or already have spun off, that's how I had my first couple successes too, was things that spun off of universities too, or spun off a NASA laboratory. So we know that model pretty well, and that's something that for my investment thesis often I'm looking for. It might not be yours, but that's where we find a lot of innovators in hiding.
David, you mentioned the international piece. So have you seen any interesting models internationally? Obviously, generally the international healthcare systems are all nationalized healthcare, so they're different systems. I tend to think that actually makes it easier to deploy some of these big blockchain solutions. Are there some learnings from foreign countries that we can bring to the U.S.? Yeah,
we've seen a lot. Anybody here from UK? We've seen a lot of things from the NHS and where they're innovating too, and where they have some centralization of their data. But what really makes sense for the blockchain is decentralization, when you do have more than one party payer system too. That's where the decentralization of the blockchain is going to make the most sense. But so many of these organizations work internationally. If you think of they don't like the word empire anymore, but if you think about all the ties to other countries that the UK has and where they help with healthcare throughout Africa, throughout parts of Asia, there's this whole area where they have to have that international use of blockchain is a great example of where you could use that for international records, international data keeping too, and moving that at a low cost across multiple systems. I'm encouraged by some of the countries, whether they have centralized and socialized medicine or not, that are really doubling down on this area too. We've had good co-investment from places like Israel, where they match from their Israeli Innovation Authority 50 cents on the dollar for the things that, and it's a grant too. It's not taking equity. They have a grant to come to the US and come through Florida and make that their launch pad to the Caribbean, Latin America, and the rest of the United States too. It's a good deal for the entrepreneurs, especially some of the ones we picked. Some of them have done quite well in Israel, and they have their own wealth. Well, why wouldn't you want to come to one of the 4 states that doesn't have any personal income tax? So it starts to make sense from that strategy too, because depends on where you go, 12 to 18% ahead, depending on parts of California or Massachusetts or other areas too that you might go to think about that. Those tax advantage strategies, those granting strategies, Germany's doing the same thing with their various provinces, is the closest word I can think of for those different areas. You're seeing a lot of public-private partnering and a lot of areas where the government's not the enemy in this. They want to help. They want these solutions for healthcare. They want these solutions for education. That's areas where you can pull.
All right, and you talk about public-private partnerships. Are there opportunities for investors to do things with your program or the University of Florida? Are there things where you're looking for
Our
partners?
Global Blockchain Ventures Fund is opening, and our emerging traffic has been existent for a few years too. And those are areas where we're starting to see some good opportunities.
And then do you focus principally on investing and working with companies locally? How do you think about things across the...
No, we kind of think about it as bringing the best of Florida to the world and bringing the best of the world to Florida, or maybe through Florida to the rest of the U.S. is probably the closest to our investment thesis for emerging traffic, and with Israel, our Startup Nation Ventures Fund. But when we get to the Global Blockchain Fund, it is what it says. We're pulling from all different areas. Our other main principles in this are the past president of Disney, Al Weiss, and also a German conglomerate too that has some larger corporate interests that they're bringing through to the U.S. too. So those are some of the big groups that are wanting to already work within this space too.
And that's specific to healthcare or broadly across blockchain?
Investment is going to be across a couple different theses. Healthcare and education are 2 of them because we have some good expertise in those areas, we think. And we're always looking for other people that have expertise in that area too to help us in those investment theses. We're also not trying to do it all ourselves too. We're only going to be a $100 million fund. We're going to work with and partner with others and either sidecar with them. We've already started doing that with some of our other partners like Stonegate. And we're also going to be looking for places that we can be fund of funds and co-invest in those areas too.
And do you have particular use cases in healthcare that you're wanting to go after? Are there particular areas that you find more rich as a investment or research matter?
A lot of my background is in data science, so a lot of the things that I'm looking at are where we can start to pair up things in the Internet of Things. That might include wearables, and where we have the data streams that come out of that, and how could those data streams be used at scale? So the scalability is a huge problem. I'm not going to underestimate that for any of you too. The speed of the networks, where you have Visa's network, and what speed you can have with Visa versus what speed you might have with blockchain, it's about a third. And that's just one network. How are you going to do that for transactions that you might have to do and not slow down something in a life-saving moment-by-moment scenario? Those are big issues if you're thinking about within the hospital system too. But when you think about how genetics and genomics are coming into this for personalized and precision medicine, those are pretty exciting areas too. And that was one of the theses at that conference in the Bahamas that we went to as well, and how those two things and digital health are coming together. So those are some of the areas of healthcare that we're looking at. We just invested in a company that has a great data science behind 3D holograms for interventional cardiology. And that may not seem like it fits, but remember I said blockchain and then you fill in the blank. How is blockchain going to change that? When you have new types of data, 3D holograms of the heart that you have to then transmit. Most of the electronic health record systems that I use, even the better PACS systems that they have for this, and some of the DICOM systems, for those of you in healthcare, that's the radiology systems, they're not ready for this. They are not ready for this. So could blockchain be ready for that? And how would that fundamentally change the way that data is going to be handled? So I know I geek out on the technology side a little bit too, but that's my area. This is a team sport though. We need the doctors, we need the investors, we need even the students, even the people that are coming up with these great ideas in small laboratories to all start to work together.
So I'm always worried about this issue. Are they ready for it? Is healthcare, are these enterprises ready? You mentioned that at least the EMRs, the data structures are really not ready for the blockchain.
Yeah, there's states of readiness. You know, I like Alex's chart for that same reason. For me, I'd rather them not be quite ready and help them get ready in terms of where I want to be on the investment and also the innovation curves and ecosystem. If you think about Jeffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm or some of the areas where do you want to be that innovator, that early adopter, early majority, late majority, or the true laggards too? Well, a lot of them, you know, we're not going to convince any of the laggards anytime soon. But the early majority, I think, is getting ready. And that's why I love seeing some of the things when, like what Tim Draper was talking about the endorsements of some of the big, he called them sheep, but I'm not calling them that, but some of the big organizations and big funds, whether that's in the Ivy League or other places, that are starting to double down and put some money into this space to the institutionals. That's a key signal for me, at least the way I look at things. You do agree with that?
I do.
Yeah.
I absolutely, no doubt about it. So in healthcare, are there particular companies or sectors where you see people moving out ahead in terms of blockchain? You mentioned the alliance with Humana and the payers around blockchain. Where are you seeing the early adopters?
Well, I'd rather not have anybody take as gospel anything I say about a particular company. So I think what I'd rather do is talk about something else that's encouraging that we haven't talked about, and that's standards and standard-making bodies. When I start seeing the IEEE coming up with data science health standards for how blockchain and distributed ledger is going to be used, and when I see Hyperledger and the Ethereum Enterprise Alliance coming together 2 weeks ago, again, indicators of things to come. I want to watch for the things that come out of that. Who are the innovators that are driving some of those areas? Because if you are helping build a standard, your chances of winning with a standard and winning at scale with a marketplace, I think, are much higher. You could look at that from Ethernet and Bob Metcalfe when he formed 3Com. There's a perfect example too. You're early in those days when those standards are being formed, and you're the winner in those standards, battles, if you want to call them that, you have a good chance of having a winning global technology that you can build a business on too. So that's what I'm watching for too. I love seeing what Hashed Health is doing as a standards making organization too, and their conference is coming up in a couple weeks if you want to see all the things in their ecosystem too. And distributed health November 5th and 6th, and also what's happening in medical tourism and their standards, and some of the standards coming out from the government too. There was just a blockchain standard release. Anybody seen it? I'll say it slowly so you can write it down. NIST, N-I-S-T, 8202, 8202. If you haven't looked at that, it might be worth a look if you're in the technology side of things too, or have your technologist go look at it for you or with you too. Those are all bellwethers of what things might come, and the people that are working in those areas, Consensus Health just reformed under Heather Flannery. Those are all exciting things to me about what's going on, and those are some of the early innovators that are now driving the ship on what's happening in those industry segments and standards making bodies.
On the standards front, Stuart Lackey from Solister is here and is on a panel later today.
Great.
Solister is a healthcare interoperability solution being built on GoChain.
Great.
So I'm an investor. I'm not shameless to plug a specific one, and I'm an advisor to Solister, I should say.
As long as we tell them we've disclosed, right?
But I'm always looking for specifics. I always want to find the investment. So.
Yeah.
So why don't we wrap it up there? Thanks for your time, David. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
your presentation.
Appreciate it. Yep.
And thank you all for being here.
We'll work with you.